The land that the ancestors of the Māori settled was unlike any they had encountered in their remembered island past. To begin with, it was enormous, 1,600 kilometres from the northern tip of Maui's fish to the base of Aoraki's canoe, with 18,000 kilometres of coastline. The landscapes ranged from coastal beach and broadleaf coastal forest to estuarine swamps, enormous inland plains, podocarp-covered hills, subalpine ranges, and mountains capped with snow, to which the formerly tropical Polynesians, having never seen such a substance previously, gave the name huka, or foam. There were thermal regions and at least 6 active or soon-to-be active volcanoes. Compared with the dimensions of Polynesia's basalt islands and coral atolls, the resources of this new country, its minerals, its forests, and the big game food provided by giant birds and seals, would have seemed vast and inexhaustible. Even the days themselves were longer in summer and therefore fuller than in equatorial regions. Second, New Zealand's temperatures and climates varied beyond Polynesian knowledge and expectation. Subtropical in the north, temperate in the central region, and cold beyond anything they could have imagined in the south. This factor would influence which of the crops they brought with them could grow, and where, and which they would have to discard. Climate would also determine what garments they would need to wear in different parts of the country, what natural materials they would choose to make them, what technical skills they would have to invent in order to make use of such new materials, and what kinds of houses they would need to build for shelter and warmth. It was the adaptation to the new environment of the concepts and practices they brought with them, and the new skills and practices they developed to meet unfamiliar environmental challenges, that transformed East Polynesian island culture into that of New Zealand Māori. And that transformation occurred over at least 3 identifiable stages, which historians have termed colonial, transitional, and tribal. The Māori colonial era began the moment East Polynesian migrants stepped ashore and continued through the first phase of settlement and adjustment. It is the period formerly referred to as archaic Māori, or, in Roger Duff's famous phrase, the Moa Hunter period of Māori culture. Duff, fresh from the excitement and revelations of his excavations on the Wairau Bar at the head of the South Island, was right to highlight the role of Moa in the economy and material culture of early settlers in that part of the country. But his phrase suggests an overly simplistic understanding of what was happening to early Māori in that era throughout New Zealand. Archaeological investigation of the earliest habitation sites shows that moa were a major source of protein, and in some cases the major source, for settlers in some parts of the country, especially the east coast of the South Island. Estimates of the number of birds killed, or at least cut up, at the mouth of the Waitaki River range from 29,000 to 90,000, and further south, at the Shag River mouth, at least 6,000 moa were slaughtered over a relatively short period of occupation. Given the size of the largest birds, the enormous amount of meat they carried, drumsticks alone the size of a leg of beef, and the relative ease with which, having no ingrained fear of ground-based predators, they would have been caught in coastal shrubland and on inland plains, the reliance of many colonial Māori on this food source is no surprise. Even the smaller bush moa had a body mass comparable with that of turkeys. The Wairau Bar excavations also revealed that early Māori used moa eggshells the size of rugby balls as water carriers, and moa bone for the manufacture of fishhooks, harpoon heads, and ornaments. Other factors, too, were important to the economy, material culture, and lifestyle of early Māori, however. The resource islands, which made up what may have been the regions of first settlement, the east coast of the far north and Coromandel Peninsula, Cook Strait, and the southeast coast of the South Island, also provided access to seals, to minerals for tool making, and, in all but the southernmost sites, suitable areas for the cultivation of some of the plants the colonists had brought with them: kumara, yam, taro, tea, gourd, and paper mulberry. Of the 8 possible root crops and 11 tree crops cultivated in tropical Polynesia, only 6 would grow in New Zealand. So moa were a significant source of protein, of bones for ornament and fishhook manufacture, and possibly of feathers for use in cloaks. But other large birds were slaughtered: the flightless goose, an enormous rail now known as the adsbill, swans and pelicans, all of them, like the moa, exploited to the point of extinction after little more than 100 years. The fur seal, sea lion and elephant seal were also killed and eaten in such large quantities that after just over a century their formerly crowded rookeries were deserted everywhere but in Fovo Strait and Fiordland. Other sea mammals such as dolphin and pilot whales were also taken by harpooning. And in each resource area, heavy use was made of local minerals for the manufacture of flake knives and adzes: obsidian from Mare Island, basalt from Coromandel, greywacke from the Hauraki Gulf, argillite and serpentine from the Nelson region, and chert and silkrete from Otago. Further, the movement of some of these materials, especially Mare Island obsidian, shows that settlers in the 3 or 4 principal regions of early settlement were in communication with one another, and either traded or exchanged goods, or made minerals available to one another by allowing freedom of movement throughout the country as a whole. While the main emphasis for the first century or so of settlement was on locating resources, hunting, and to a lesser extent on foraging for shellfish and fish, it is a mistake to portray these early peoples, as some writers have done, solely as hunter-gatherers. The fact that 6 of the plants they brought from tropical Polynesia survived shows that from the outset, at least in the more northerly settlements, attention was given to planting, nurturing and harvesting them. They were cultivated throughout the period of Māori colonial settlement so as to be available to play a more important role in post-colonial Māori life when the big game was gone. Continued gardening, in other words, constituted a dietary insurance policy. The disposition of early settlement sites and their size and character point to an important conclusion. The lifestyle of these people was, if not quite nomadic, certainly mobile. They would occupy a home base, probably the place where gardening and tool-making took place, and a constellation of stations for activities appropriate to certain times of the year: hunting moa or seals, foraging for seafood, collecting minerals. It is probable that whole communities took part in these activities as they moved from place to place, and that there was less specialization than in the later and more stationary tribal era. Louise Fury has described one base settlement in Northland occupied in the early 14th century. In total, 3,200 objects are known from Hauhora. These include adzes, ornaments, fishing gear, bone harpoon points, bone needles, tattoo chisels, bone chisels and awls, and manufacturing tools such as stone drill points, hammerstones, sandstone files, and scrapers. These show that there was a full range of activities taking place at Hauhora. The people were engaged in everyday activities to procure food, to manufacture objects in wood, stone and bone, and participating in other activities encompassing the social dimension, for example, competitive sports such as dart throwing or tattooing. Snapper was the dominant food species, followed by seals, but in terms of calorific value, seals exceeded all other species. The moa were probably caught some distance away from the village and brought back as dismembered carcasses. Seals were brought back to the site whole if pups and lighter juveniles, but adults are only represented by bones which were attached to large muscles. Dolphins were hunted using small bone harpoons. The meat was cut up and cooked in an umu, mandibles used to make fishhooks, and teeth drilled and strung as necklaces. The significant lack of vertebrae for the number of fish represented evidence of fish drying in the summer and of storage for later use. There is also evidence of preserving birds. These people in the early 14th century were already following a seasonal round of food procuring, preservation and storage which persisted for hundreds of years. Significantly, skeletal remains from early settlement sites show the inhabitants to have been well nourished and healthy, even though they seldom lived beyond their late 30s. Historians have speculated that one consequence of this health, itself a result largely of the high-protein diet available to the first generations of settlers, would have been a high rate of fertility. Skeletal remains again reveal that women may have borne as many as 4 or 5 children, and this would have led to a rapid population increase, and therefore to additional pressure on food resources in the first 2 or 3 generations of settlement. As a determinant of culture and lifestyle, the Māori colonial period appears to have lasted between 100 and 150 years. After that relatively short period, the big game was all but exhausted. The northern seal rookeries were deserted, in part because hunters had killed mothers and pups along with adult males. Moa became extinct because of the profligate manner in which this resource too was exploited, a process the Australian ecological historian Tim Flannery would refer to as future eating. With the moa had disappeared a range of other birds, mostly flightless, some of them humanly hunted to extinction, others pursued and killed at the egg, fledgling or adult stage by the rats and dogs which the East Polynesians had brought with them. Most mainland sources of shearwaters and petrels, which nested in burrows, would also have disappeared from a combination of intensive hunting and rat and dog predation. Another factor which accelerated the extinctions was destruction of habitat. Pollen and charcoal cores in swamps reveal that for whatever reason a series of major fires occurred in the 14th and 15th centuries, destroying forests especially in Hawke's Bay and down the east coast of the South Island, but also in inland areas of the North Island and on parts of the Northland and Coromandel peninsulas. The period of the fires coincided with the spectacular decline in the numbers of moa and other large hunted birds. It is possible that fires began as an effort to clear open living spaces, and later to drive surviving moa and other ground birds out of their places of hiding. Once started, many fires may have flared out of control. Another theory is that they represent an effort to encourage the growth of bracken fern, which in the Māori tribal era became an important food source. There may be some truth in this, but it is scarcely adequate to explain the full extent of deforestation. The hypothesis that links this with a more desperate and reckless phase of hunting is more plausible. Who were the people of this era? That is a difficult, if not impossible, question to answer historically. Māori Whakapapa offer names without remains, that is, stories without evidence, while archaeology offers remains without names, evidence without stories. Māori oral tradition has much to say about the voyages of respective canoes to New Zealand, but little about how people lived in the period of initial settlement. The exception is the large number of stories about ancestors naming geographical features, important markers in tribal tradition that validated occupation and mana whenua, the right of the descendants of discoverers to hold authority over such places. The very absence of other kinds of stories of how people became established in a strange land has led to speculation that some canoe traditions may refer to internal migration within New Zealand rather than voyages from Island Polynesia. The point of oral tradition, however, was that it recorded what people needed to know to understand and justify present circumstances, not domestic detail about how people lived and worked in an earlier era. In most parts of the country, even knowledge of the moa itself, that considerable contributor to the health and well-being of colonial Māori, had dropped out of remembered tradition by the time of European settlement. With moa gone, there was no reason to recall them down succeeding generations. Roger Duff's description of the boulder bank separating the estuary of the Wairau River from the sea in the north of the South Island is, however, sufficient to conjure up some of the activities of early Māori who lived there. In some ways these are similar to, and in others different from, their contemporaries in Hauhora. This site was almost certainly a seasonally occupied hunting camp rather than a village home base. The boulder bank would prove the most suitable site for their fishing and fowling economy, and the northern tip of it the obvious spot to settle on. Here the river mouth gave access to the sea for fish and trading expeditions, while along the sea beach accumulated the large quantities of firewood necessary in a treeless spot. The whitebait and kahawai ran seasonally into the river and lagoon. Herrings, eels and flounders formed a more permanent population, and banks of edible shellfish thrived at the entrance. In addition, the extinct swan flourished in this favourable estuary, as well as great numbers of duck. Finally, the site was well placed for hunting the large numbers of Moas, whose bones are spread today over the 15 to 20 acres of the main occupation site. Perhaps they were rounded up in the Wairau plain, or driven down from the Vernon Hills, and in either case herded round the base of the Mataora lagoon, and then driven along the trap of the boulder bank to the cul-de-sac provided by its northern end. Another possibility is that these birds were hunted some distance inland, and brought by canoe or raft down the Wairau River to the camp site. Of the methods of taking the swan and other waterfowl, we may be reasonably sure. Advantage would be taken of the annual moult when the birds were unable to fly and could be rounded up. The first signs of Moa Hunter occupation occur on the inner slope of the main ridge, which occupies a halfway line between the sea beach and the lagoon. The signs here are most obvious and include a line of pits or ovens surrounded by masses of midden refuse. It would appear to have been the main cooking area of the settlement and situated for convenience some 3 chains from the main habitation site. This latter hut area carries extensive, though not obtrusive, signs of long-continued occupation. The most important burial area occurred on the outer fringes of it. Bones of Moas, dogs, seals, birds, fish, etc. are found evenly distributed everywhere, but Moa eggshell is more common in the hut area. Helen Leach and Philip Houghton have reconstructed a more specific account of the living circumstances of a 35 to 40-year-old woman whose remains were excavated in Palliser Bay on the northern side of Cook Strait. This community, perhaps transitional rather than early colonial, was one that did not rely on Moa for protein or raw materials. In life she stood 162.6 centimetres tall, was fairly robust and right-handed. She had given birth to between 2 and 4 children. By the time of her death she was suffering from quite severe wear and abscessing on her teeth. Evidence of arthritis in the spine may be linked to the deterioration in health that accompanied these infections. Her diet, or the sand that blew into her food, was clearly very abrasive. The small community in which she lived occupied a group of sleeping huts and cooking sheds on the north bank of the ponded mouth of the Makotukutuku River. Although seasonal trips were made to catch birds such as tuis and parakeets and to gather berries from the forested valleys of the Aorangi Mountains, the coastal village was permanently occupied because of proximity to its gardens and seafood resources. The gardens were located on the old raised beach ridges and swales just behind the village. Their shallow stony soils, which had formed under coastal scrub, had been cleared by fire. Of the tropical crops introduced by her ancestors, this woman grew mainly the kumara and gourd, best suited to the harsher climate and light soils of the area. In autumn, the kumara harvest was carefully stored within enclosed pits, close to the cooking sheds. When not occupied by gardening, she gathered seafood from the intertidal platform, especially paua, top shells, limpets and crayfish. Some of the fish eaten at the village were caught inshore using circular hooks of bone and shell, but when sea conditions were suitable, the men caught fish such as barracuda and kahawai by trolling lures behind canoes. Rats and eels were trapped close to the village, and domestic dogs were killed to supplement the meat of sea mammals, such as dolphins and seals. During the summer months, food gathering included items for preservation. The long hours of daylight were fully occupied with the splitting of eels and other oily fish for drying, and the weaving of kete for storage. Her heavy workload in summer and autumn would have slackened in winter, and she was fortunate to have fresh water and firewood close at hand throughout the year. Her death in her 4th decade would not have been unexpected, since few adults survived long, given their physically demanding lifestyle. She was buried in the vicinity of several family members and a pet dog. In the 14th and 15th centuries, with the demise of big game, early Māori were required to make major adjustments in their culture and lifestyle in order to survive. They did so by extending and intensifying their remaining sources of food production and foraging. Gardening would have become increasingly important. In all but the lower half of the South Island, it may eventually have been responsible for up to half the total food requirement. Foraging, too, would have remained a large part of the routine of daily life. Of food sources that had had some significance previously, especially salt and freshwater fish and shellfish, and of the raw foods of the forest, hearts of Nico palm and cabbage tree, berries and drupes when seasonally available, especially the kernel of the karaka berry. It may have been around this time that wild plants such as karaka, cabbage tree and bracken fern began to be semi-cultivated. And birds which had been ignored in the era of big game hunting would now become an important food source: weka, pigeon, kiwi, tui and others. The flighted bush birds would always be difficult to catch, however, and would never be taken in large numbers because Māori lacked adequate projectile weapons. Spears were difficult to use in thick forest, and snaring became the preferred option. It is probable that the experience and the penalties of pursuing larger game to extinction would have led to the development of more sustainable practices in the hunting of remaining birds of the forest and sea. The period of the 14th and 15th centuries has been termed transitional for 2 other reasons. One is a gradual alteration in art forms, from the unequivocally East Polynesian shapes and motifs of the earliest settlers towards those that came to be associated with classic Māori culture. These alterations were especially noticeable in wood carving and items of personal ornamentation, such as hei tiki. This period was also the phase in which Māori groups became less nomadic, more settled in defined territories, and began to form those larger associations based partly on kin and partly on areas of occupation that would be the major social characteristic of the tribal era. Several factors contributed to the concentration of activities on more restricted areas of occupation. First, the demise of big game and the growth of population gave communities less incentive and opportunity to roam over large areas of the country. A diminution in the use of the original ocean-going canoes and their eventual obsolescence might have been another factor in this lifestyle change. Second, the very concentration on the more efficient exploitation of other food sources, especially gardening, required communities to become more sedentary and more disciplined in the focus of their activities. Third, the practice that developed of preserving kumara tubers in storage pits, a process that had been unnecessary in a tropical climate, meant that communities had to remain with those pits, particularly in an era of larger population when competition for resources meant that less well-provisioned neighbours might be tempted to raid your larder. This last factor, more than any other, gave impetus to the rise and spread from north to south of fortified hilltops, which came to be known as pa. They probably originated from a need to protect kumara tubers, but they persisted and became more important when population growth, competition for all resources, the pursuit of mana, or authority for one's own group, and a generally more martial culture meant that communities increasingly had to protect themselves from immediate neighbours or from marauding enemies from further afield. It was a combination of all these factors, but especially the growth of population and increased competition for resources, which that growth brought, that favoured the growth of tribal organisation and culture through the 15th and 16th centuries. This development was not consistent throughout the country. In the south of the South Island, for example, because of smaller populations and less competition for resources, people remained more nomadic for longer and may eventually have become tribal, largely because of absorption by peoples who had migrated from the North Island, where they had already developed the characteristics and patterns of tribal culture. Even in the north, however, the archaeological record shows that some groups would retain something closer to a hunter-gatherer culture at the same time as near neighbours were becoming more settled and more tribally organised. The record also suggests that those who retained some of the features of Maori colonial life longer than other groups eventually fell victim to the larger-scale organisation of purpose and resources which tribal culture allowed. In other words, in the North Island and top of the South Island, in order to retain congenial places in which to live and proximity to food and mineral resources, there would have been strong incentives to become part of larger groupings of people and to develop tribal structures. This in turn created a concomitant ability to call upon larger and more organised groups for such coordinated activities as gardening and net fishing and fighting in attack or defence. Through the transitional to tribal phases of New Zealand Maori culture, another development also occurred. Whatever their reasons for emigrating, the first settlers, the colonists, would have been intensely conscious of the cultural and physical landscapes they were leaving behind in Island Polynesia. It is probable, too, that they would have had to abandon kinsfolk, whose absence would have been mourned. They would have continued to tell the accumulated stories of those places to themselves and to children and grandchildren, all with a view to, as had become customary in Polynesian cultures, keeping alive the names and deeds of recent ancestors. As generation followed generation in the new land, however, and as the more recent experience of a migratory voyage and the measures needed to ensure survival in what was initially an unfamiliar environment generated another cycle of sagas for oral tradition, awareness of and concern for the places of origin would have diminished. Those places would have receded to the status of a kind of Arthurian world, which was eventually little more than a hazy background to the history and experience steadily and vividly accumulating on Te Ika a Maui or Te Waka a Aoraki. They would never be entirely forgotten or unacknowledged. They would continue to be recalled in such ritual phrases as Hawaiki Nui, Hawaiki Roa, Hawaiki Pamamau, Hawaiki being the traditional word for homeland. But they would ebb further away from remembered human experience and into the realm of mythology. At the same time, many of the place names and stories which had been carried from the homelands were localized and transplanted. New Zealand acquired its quota of hikurangis, monganuis and motutapus, and other names familiar throughout Polynesia. The existence of Ranginui and Papatuanuku and the doings of Tani Mahuta and Tangaroa and their siblings came to be seen as reference to the sky and soil and sea and fauna of New Zealand. Moui Tiki Tiki a Taranga became a local cultural hero, in addition to being a Polynesia-wide one, and natural features in the landscape, including the North Island itself, came to be attributed to his doings. In other words, over succeeding generations, the cultural focus shifted steadily away from cultures of origin to a singular awareness of and commitment to the adopted homeland. At the same time, new technologies and practices were tried for meeting new environmental challenges. Different kinds of dwelling and clothing to keep warm. Different ways of growing, gathering, preserving and storing food. New forms of carving and ornamentation reflected both different working mediums and shifting perceptions of cultural and spiritual realities. A new mineral such as pounamu, greenstone, allowed the development of more elaborate carving, and the fine fibres of New Zealand flax, the weaving of more comfortable and more beautiful garments. What all this added up to was the process by which an imported culture, that of East Polynesians, left to develop in isolation, became an indigenous one, Te Ao Māori, and that new culture would focus fully on the islands of New Zealand and its human, animal and botanic inhabitants. It would offer those human inhabitants a comprehensible place in the cosmos and a prospect of physical and spiritual security, or at least as much of those things as could be expected in a world where life was, if not invariably nasty, then sometimes brutish and short.